This video is designed to help you relax or fall asleep. Before we begin, if you think you might fall asleep, please introduce yourself in the comments. Please also like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. As always, I'd love to know where you're watching from. So let us know in the comments and share what time it is where you are. Thank you once more for joining me. Get comfortable, grab a glass of water, make sure you've locked your door, and turn off the lights. Don't forget to say hello in the comments. It's time to close your eyes. To understand my story, you need to know a bit about trespassing laws in our country. We don't have any. As long as you are respectful and non-destructive, you can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing. So long as you leave the area as you found it. I used to love camping as a child. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There were always yachts bobbing just off the shore with people in them, and other campers lining up the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this was the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out, then got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I remember this because I got my dog in winter 2010 after picking her out that November. I got her from the shelter as a birthday gift to myself since I paid her adoption fee. She will be very important to the story later on. Let me tell you a little about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dog fighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is, but my best guess is a Lurcher Staffy mix. She is a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most dogs, but you absolutely do not threaten her. By the time of this camping trip, I had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but as far as my family is concerned, dogs go on camping trips, so we all piled into the car, and she came with us. Unusually, none of the family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog, and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we left a bit later than normal, although I don't remember why, we arrived at sunset, not a good time to be building a tent. But we expected to arrive to other campers already set up, the beach illuminated by campfires. The beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car while they sat, pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year, and I wanted her to have air. I always got to be looking out for my furry little homie. As we fumbled about in the dark on a beach in the middle of nowhere, it was pretty spooky. The one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big O shape if you felt like it. I wasn't really paying any attention to the road. I was complaining I was tired, as kids do. But my mom was. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, My mom asked him if he had seen that car drive around. It's been a few times. My dad kind of shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mom said it must be security. I don't know why a random beach would have security, and I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down to do their work. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool, a junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into the flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches, although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding onto the camping mallet, and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried to initially be a bit friendly with the guy and told him that was fine, we'd leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us, so my dad started shouting, and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad and possibly us as well once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put her relationship with my dad above us. This isn't how it went down. From the black, like a wolf descending on its prey, took us all by surprise, most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator, large canines representing nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in the arm she latched onto. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him. She stayed with us, covered in blood. As quickly as we could, we gathered our things and all got back in the car, all pretty shook up by the incident. I looked Parmy over. She was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I left it. We think what had happened was when the shouting started, she must have put a paw upon the gap I'd left for her, as it was an old car and had the manual windows, not an electric button. We think she must have been able to hit it with her paws to force it down enough to squeeze out. This is not the end of my story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had a dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided to just drive home so we could all feel safe, but first, we had to drive into the nearest town for petrol as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a gas station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer and stuck his head out of the window to get a better look at the sign. My mom asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. My heart sank. Parked in the corner behind a van, so we didn't see him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was too remote. The next town over was 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol. We realized as we began driving, we were going to break down. "That's fine," Dad said. We had a cover. They'd come to his home, or at least somewhere acceptable for the night, better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flashed from behind. Another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him, following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us, but we weren't really little kids. We were both double digits. We knew how dangerous this situation was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the man followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home, just grateful nothing worse had happened than that. After getting some sleep, my mom phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened, and they never got back to her after that. But apparently, the woman she spoke to said they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then, other than avoiding the crazy man on the beach? Well, for me, it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled as one of my mom's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day, but I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken shelter to where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home, she forgave but never forgot. I think the saying is, I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. They have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. I paid £78 for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid, but it chills me to my bones knowing if I hadn't been so insistent on a dog, I might have been killed. I would like to state that this story might read like the plot of a 1980s horror movie and is going to be very long. However, this entire story is true. If not for being 5 miles from cell reception and the way the story ends, there would be a police report for verification. I tried to camp with my buddy twice a month, now that I have a vehicle that can be trusted to get me to some of the more remote areas of our state. We planned a camping trip for the past weekend. We chose a fairly remote location that we'd been to the previous weekend. The previous weekend, we were the only people we'd seen within 1 mile of our camp spot. Friday night, we got there and set up. This story takes place Saturday night. It's about 9 p.m., so the sun is long gone and the moon hasn't quite risen yet. It's pitch black out, other than what our fire lights up. Suddenly, we hear a man screaming. We listen intently, silently sharing an anxious look. At first, we were hoping it was someone drunk and having a little too much fun, but it quickly becomes obvious this isn't fun party screaming. It isn't even like he's hurt, it sounds full of despair, anger, and anguish. I'm going to take a moment to remind you that this is 9 p.m., pitch black night in the middle of nowhere, 5 miles from the nearest cell phone signal. We hadn't seen anyone in hours. The screaming continues for what felt like hours, but was probably about 5 solid minutes. We had no idea what to make of it and started feeling extremely paranoid. We gathered up anything remotely close to a weapon and tried to come up with explanations for the screaming while keeping our eyes on the forest around us. After about 10 to 15 minutes of fear-induced paranoia, I nearly fell out of my seat as I watched a flashlight and lantern slowly enter our camp. I greeted the stranger with a basic "how's it going?" before he was even lit up by the fire. He responded quickly but flatly by asking if we could do him a favor. "That depends on the favor," my buddy and I said in unison, obviously tense, holding our weapons close to us. The stranger proceeded to ask if he could hang out for a second by the fire. Given that there were 2 of us and only one of him, plus our myriad of weapons gathered from around the camp to within our arm's reach, we decided to agree and let him hang out. After a short second of awkward silence, I asked him what the hell was going on. He proceeds to tell us that he was camping down the trail with his buddy and that his buddy had snapped and tried to kill him. "Wait, what?" I said before the thought even finished processing in my head. "Is that the screaming we heard earlier?" The man slowly nods, staring blankly into the fire, and begins his story. "We were just hanging out. We came up earlier today and my buddy just freaked out. He started screaming and just wouldn't stop. Then he attacked me. He lunged at me, and I told him to just back off and chill. Well, he kept coming after me and it started getting pretty violent, and I'm pretty sure he was going to kill me. So, I grabbed my car keys, the light, and I ran. I don't know what to do. He chased me when I ran, and I don't know what to do. We don't have firearms or anything, we only have a hatchet." My buddy and I looked at each other for a second, completely astonished, then something horrible dawned on me. "Wait, he chased you? Like, he's on his way here?" The man just slowly nods in reply, and right on cue, like some terrible horror movie come to life, we hear screaming from maybe 30 to 40 feet from our camp down on the main trail. "I just want to talk," is what we heard him screaming. I'd never in my life heard a man scream like this. I'd never heard anything like it. It was a brutal scream that was shrill to the ears, yet deep in pitch, the sound of someone gone completely mad. And the way he said the stranger's name would switch erratically from long and melodic to short punches of sound. We killed our lights, became silent, and listened. By some miracle, the madman did not notice our camp and continued walking down the trail, screaming the whole way. We ended up chatting with this scary guy for hours, listening to the screaming getting further and further away. We'd come to find out they had taken 4.5 to 5 grams of mushrooms each, and Gary's buddy was a coworker of his and was fine for 3 hours, then suddenly snapped. It seemed as though he thought he could kill Gary and steal his good trip. We hear the screamings getting further and further for over 2 hours. By this time, it's 11 p.m., the moon is starting to come out, and it's below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. He had no jacket or flashlight, according to Gary. My buddy and I are way too drunk to drive out camp to get cell service, as it was snowy and icy and required 2 to 3 miles of highway driving after getting off the trail. Gary was still lightly feeling the effects of mushrooms, so he couldn't drive back either. We had to make the decision to let the guy wander, hoping he sobered up and could find his way back. And he did, right into our camp. We hear yelling after about an hour of no screams, maybe 30 to 50 feet from camp again. "Hey, help, please help me." We tell Gary to hide, just in case, and we'd greet the man, with me carrying my 12-gauge shotgun, holstered, my buddy carrying his rifle, and also with our flashlights on their brightest settings in his face. He was about 6 feet 2 inches and approximately 300 pounds. We talked to him, decided he was calm enough to talk with, and walked him back to his camp. He seemed really remorseful, said he blacked out and didn't remember anything, that he had a falling out with his buddy. We escorted him back to his camp down the trail, returned, and told Gary that he seemed cool, and if anything else happens to scream and come running, we would come out and help him out. It ended up being a happy ending. We made friends with Gary, and I got his phone number to make sure the next day that he got back into town safely, back to his wife and kid. And we're actually planning on a camping trip with him soon. But the other guy, who wandered screaming like a deranged maniac in the forest, potentially wielding a hatchet to murder his friend, was not invited. This all went down during the spring break of my junior year of high school. My school was in a pretty small Iowa town with a district spanning several smaller hamlets. During the summer of 2014, a few friends of mine put together a film club that would make short films and compete in national film festivals against other schools. We were a pretty small group, and I found it kind of difficult to get together for any actual filming until spring break of 2015, when we made plans for a little excursion. 4 of us ended up going on the trip, myself and 3 members of the club, let's call them Jake, Bill, and Kyle. We ended up choosing to go camping at Mossy Glen Hollow, a supposedly haunted state park in northeastern Iowa. Since the 1850s, there have been several murders and suicides at Mossy Glen, including a few decapitations and a hired hitman in the 1930s. Being the edgy teens that we were, we jumped at the chance to go hiking and camping somewhere like that. It was within 15 minutes of a small town as well, so stocking up on food wouldn't be that big of an issue either. So, all lights green, we loaded up 2 of our sedans, programmed the GPS, and off we went for a spring break camping in some haunted woods. After the first hour and a half on the road, a few red flags began to fly. After the last large town before getting away into the boondocks, my phone's data signal cut out, and the GPS randomly changed directions on us. Since none of us had any idea where the hell we were at, or where Mossy Glen was supposed to be, we didn't have much choice but to blindly follow the new route. Once we were firmly in the middle of nowhere, our GPS took us off the paved highways and onto gravel roads. At this point, you typically would see the usual brown Iowa DNR signs designating that you were near a state park, but there were none. There weren't even any tree clumps to indicate that you were near some sort of forest. Another 10 minutes or so into the drive, and the gravel road soon turns into a dirt road, then a low-maintenance road, then a Class B minimum maintenance road. With Iowa's dedication to road preservation, this basically means that somebody probably came by and took a peek in the 90s and then promptly forgot about its existence. As we came around the last hilly bend that the GPS shows on our route, we see a farmhouse with a large machine shed, with no lights or activity around either, and no cars in the driveway. A bit weirded out that a house would be right next to a state park, we slow down and keep rolling. To our dismay, however, the road dissolves into a mess of washed tractor tire gouges from last fall's harvest. We stop the cars as far down as we can pass without getting hung up on a frozen rut and unpack some of our equipment. The road gradually narrows, snakes down the middle of a field, and turns down into a small but very thick clump of woods at the bottom of a wide ravine. We get out and hike down the gradually steepening slope and take in the scenery. At first, everything looks like a pretty damn cool set to a film. There are several limestone outcrops hanging off the hillside, a footpath with some picturesque tree overhang, and even a few birds out that made an unseasonal return from wintering down south. We can all hear some water running but can't identify a source from the trail. Looking off in any direction, all we could see was a seemingly endless sea of trees. At the bottom of the hill was a small pond in the middle of a grassy clearing with a fence. As we approached the fence, we noticed a sign, "Private property. Keep out." Bill checks his watch and realizes that it's almost time for dinner, so we trek back to our vehicles and hook up the GPS. The nearest town over was a little place called Edgewood that had several diners and a gas station to load up on supplies for the week. We brought some canned food, but not much beyond that. As we got to town, we realized that Edgewood was a lot smaller than we'd expected, less than 900 people, it would turn out. Everyone knows everyone in these small towns, so we got several weird looks when 4 strangers rolled up with plates from the other side of the state. Kyle asked the cashier and a few people at the gas station about Mossy Glen Hollow and why the only route was through some dude's field on a busted outdoor road. To our surprise, nobody had even heard of a place called Mossy Glen, nor could they figure out why the hell 4 high schoolers suddenly rolled into town looking for the place. We shrugged it off as just a few crazy locals and took back down the dirt trail. As we rounded the corner back near the farmhouse, we noticed that all the lights were still off and nobody seemed to be home. I suggested that we leave some sort of note on the house door that we were going to be parking on the side of the road near their place, just to be safe. It was starting to get late in the day, and being this far out in the country, it wouldn't be unheard of to come face to face with a shotgun when the homeowners found our cars. Since the road was impassable from that point on anyway, parking there wouldn't realistically block anybody off the road and would still technically be on public land. We hiked back down the wooded trail and started scouting for a place to set up camp for the night, making sure to be on the public side of the fence pond area. We discovered that the sea of trees that we saw earlier was actually quite a bit thinner when seen from below. In fact, the dirt path led to a decently sized clearing with a creek and small waterfall cutting through the limestone deposits. None of us could believe that we had missed such a thing a few hours earlier. When Bill comes to the realization, he disappeared around the corner back into the trees and emerges at the top of the trail a few minutes later. Though we could plainly see him, the trees lined up just right so that he could not see anything beyond the rocks below the path ledge. Continuing further up the creek, we noticed that there are conveniently placed rocks about the perfect distance apart to step over without disturbing the water or surrounding rocks. One could walk almost silently down the creek while the sound of the water masked the steps. Not thinking much of it, we take some pictures of the large moss-covered boulders all around and get some pretty nice scenic shots. We find a place to make camp, and everything is going great until we approach the waterfall. Just before the waterfall sat a clearing without any large boulders or rocks, and an odd arrangement of logs. One set horizontal, supported at each end by 2 piles of rocks. There was a crude stone circle with a pile of burnt logs inside, a fire pit with a bench. Although a bit surprised at first, we shrugged it off as some weekend project that the people of the house put together. After all, with such a cool place just a short walk from home, why not? I have a similar fire pit set up at home, so I'm not too concerned. "Hey, what the hell is this?" Kyle yells from a boulder a few yards ahead. There was an orange beanie, a single gardening glove, an empty can of beer, and a stick of deodorant that had seen some serious wear. Looking closer at the beer can, we realized that it must have been opened fairly recently. Foam is still fresh in the bottom of the can, and it still had a fumey smell. Bewildered by what the hell we just found, Jake starts looking around the side of the boulders upstream of the items. "There's a cave over here," he shouts back to us. Later, he told us that the cave was large enough to comfortably fit a person inside, and, more disturbingly, he saw some red fabric inside as well. Before he can get a good look around, Kyle calls all three of us back over to him with a sense of urgency. He speaks very quietly to us and indicates that we shouldn't shout back. "Shampoo," he whispers, pointing urgently down at his feet. Sure enough, in the mud and the leaves, there's a blue bottle of Suave shampoo right next to the creek. At this point, we're all adequately freaked out and ready to call our little soiree quits. Bill remains pretty sure that this is just junk left behind by the people of the house after a weekend of a few too many drinks, but things just didn't add up to me. There's one detail that I've been leaving out up to this point. The day before, this part of Iowa caught some heavy rain, which contributed to the mud situation on the road and on the trail. With the combination of wind and rain, the items on the rocks would have shown some signs of being wet, if not been displaced entirely. Also, the air was pretty cold, as it is every year around this time, not getting above the mid-40s for the whole week. Then, everything starts to click for me. Whoever drank the beer and left the shampoo, hat, glove, and deodorant must have done so this morning. The fire pit also had fresh char marks on the rocks, and the wood had not been wet for a while, meaning that it must have been lit last night at the earliest. The small cave would have provided enough shelter from the rain to stay dry. With the freezing temps all throughout the day, whoever was using shampoo out here must have had little other choice to do so. If it was the homeowners, they would have had to be serious masochists, debating the shallow freezing rocky creek rather than at home. If it wasn't them, then we likely weren't alone right now. Whoever left these things out left in a hurry, and if they were here 4 hours ago, they would have been able to see us on the trail cliff long before we even knew they were down here. Remembering the arrangement of rocks on the stream, they could have even been leaving their camp just as we were coming down the dirt trail. As I processed this, I started to look around at my surroundings and realized that the small area was bordered by the thick trees on the trail side, several sets of huge boulders on the pond side, and limestone cliffs everywhere else. Due to the tree, rock, and hill cover, you could light a fire in the pit at night, and nobody around would ever know. If you were wearing brown or green, you could easily see down from the rocks on top to the camp below while blending in with the trees above. Coming to these realizations, I noticed something else, something more sinister. The birds and small animals that we previously heard were now quiet. Aside from the soft babble of the creek, the entire place was completely silent. As I started to explain this to the rest of the group, I saw the wheels turning in their heads as well. Jake starts to head back to the small cave when something rustling up on the limestone ridgeline catches our attention. Something large was shifting around up there, something that apparently didn't want Jake to see what was in the cave. We all look up, and whatever made the noise starts shuffling down the ridge toward the makeshift camp. Because of the high cliff, the only way down to us would be by going all the way back down to the pond and then doubling back up the stream. Realizing this almost by ourselves, and how open we were, we booked it back up the stream, up the dirt path, across the field, and back to our cars. On the drive back to Edgewood, we all tried to process what just happened. I take a look at the satellite map, and the only really accessible way to the cliff where we heard the noise would be to walk up there from the pond. It was too craggy to approach from the adjacent field to the east. Whatever made that noise would have had to be large too, and a deer getting up there wouldn't necessarily be out of the question. It would have had some incredible timing to have started moving just as Jake started looking at the cave and whatever red fabric was inside. Kyle found a report of an escaped convict from a local prison a few weeks ago and was convinced that it was his camp that we found, but we were all doubtful at best of this idea. To satisfy his concerns, we agreed to report the strange things we found to the police anonymously, since we all wanted to really get home at this point. None of us followed up on them, and I doubt anything came out of it. A small town police department gets a report of strange sightings from some stranger, and the same day, some high schoolers roll up and park outside a farmer's house for a few hours. Doesn't exactly spell high-threat criminal activity to me. Still, things just don't seem to add up. Whoever came running down that cliff, if indeed it was a who, wanted to keep whatever was inside the cave hidden, but not enough to actually fight some teenagers. We figured he just wanted to scare us off since the noises seemed to stop once we reached the dirt path. I thought it odd that someone living out in the woods with something seemingly to hide would set up shop in a state park. That is until I checked my GPS again. That little route that it took us on was an old entrance to the park that had been cut off by the purchase of the lake area. The map records used for Google's navigation were updated and we couldn't see that. The place we were at was still public land, for sure, but not quite what we pictured. I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back, and had dinner. It was all very normal. Until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler in a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and placed the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. When we woke up the next morning, I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown, and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces, lying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt strange. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong. My ex accused me of not locking the car and said that an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had a dream about something kneeling over him in the tent, holding his gun, and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. I grew up in these woods and usually feel comfortable there. However, I stumbled into a few unsettling situations that would stick in my mind forever. This was one such occasion. I was 18 at the time. One evening, my two friends, Mike and Paul, and I decided to go camping. Well, camping might not be the right word since we didn't plan to spend the night, just chill and have some fun around the campfire for a while. The plan was simple: head out, build a campfire, drink a few bottles of wine, eat something, and head back home for a good night's sleep. We met at my house while it was still sunny outside, got ready, and headed out. Our destination was an old abandoned quarry in the middle of the woods, about 40 minutes from my house. Even though the quarry had a tragic and frankly creepy history, it was a popular place for such occasions. When we got there, the sky was already reddish as the sun slowly sank behind the hills. We quickly gathered all the firewood we could find so we wouldn't have to look for it later. As darkness fell and everything around us turned into impenetrable blackness, we managed to get the fire going. We were in a great mood and were getting ready for our first toast. That's when we realized we made a horrible mistake. We forgot the corkscrew. We attempted to open the wine without it, but quickly gave up. The bottles were quite expensive, and we didn't want to damage them. At this point, it was clear that one of us would have to jog back to retrieve the corkscrew. After some discussion, I volunteered with two conditions. Firstly, they would give me a hatchet in case something went wrong along the way. Secondly, no pranks when I got back. Mike and Paul agreed without hesitation. They handed me a hatchet and a flashlight and sent me on my way. As I jogged through the forest, I heard a noise resembling a boar. Suddenly, I remembered a warning I received from an older hunter a few days ago. He said that at this time of year, boars were getting dangerous, especially at night. I was a bit nervous, but luckily managed to survive unharmed. I arrived safely back home, much to the surprise of my mom, who didn't expect me so early. I explained the situation. She just laughed. I grabbed the corkscrew and headed back. Not wanting to encounter a boar, I chose another slightly longer path, this time through an open field. After a while, I reached our spot. It was a small clearing surrounded on one side by massive rocks, maybe 70 meters tall, and on the other side by a thick forest. Our campfire was in the middle of the clearing. When I approached it, I realized that there wasn't anybody around, although our backpacks were still on the ground and the fire was burning brightly. Great! We specifically agreed that there would be no pranks when I got back. Those guys think they're funny, I thought to myself. I resignedly sat down near the fire facing the woods. That's the only place where they could have hidden, I thought. I was really tired, and all I could think about was the taste of that exquisite Pinot that we brought with us. I wasn't in the mood for their games, and I was getting quite mad. That's when I heard the snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves from the edge of the forest, maybe 30 meters from where I was sitting. The sound was rhythmic and undoubtedly the sound of somebody walking. I aimed my flashlight in that direction and spotted a tall person wearing a dark hoodie. As I shined my flashlight on him, he stopped walking, turned towards me, and just kept staring motionlessly. Even though he was facing me directly, I couldn't see his face. I shouted, "Paul, you fat jerk. I know you're trying to scare me. We agreed on something, so stop messing around and come out." As I finished, the hooded figure turned and walked deeper into the woods. At that moment, my phone started ringing. I hurriedly took it out of my pocket. It was Mike. I took the call and started barking at him, "Really funny, you guys. I thought we agreed on something. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you trying to mess with me. I clearly saw you, so you can come out." Mike seemed frozen for a minute. For what felt like an eternity, all I could hear was his heavy breathing and Paul mumbling something in the background. When he finally snapped back to reality, he said, "Dude, we're at your house." We heard some footsteps. At first, we thought it was you messing with us. But then we got scared and decided to look for you. I forgot my phone at your house, so we couldn't even call you. Just get out of there, and we'll come back for our stuff together. Nonsense. That's just another of your stupid pranks, and I'm not buying it. Hold on a second. There was some incoherent mumbling for a while. Hey, what's going on? My mom's voice suddenly came from the phone. My head spun, and my heart skipped a beat as I realized they weren't kidding. Suddenly, a wave of fear ran through my body. However, I managed to convince my mom that everything was fine and that she shouldn't worry. She gave the phone back to Mike. "Just leave everything and come back. We're heading over right now. We'll meet you halfway there. I'm not going anywhere alone again. You better get here quick. I'm waiting for you." I hung up. I didn't want to make any more noise than I already did. I quickly turned off my flashlight and backed off from the light of the fire. I moved all the way to the huge wall of rocks, figuring that if I had my back covered, it would eliminate one possible approach for the unwanted visitor. I stood there in complete darkness, trying not to make a sound while tightly clutching my hatchet, which would be my best friend for the next half an hour. I had to convince myself not to curl into a ball in fear. Even my own body started to betray me as my hearing worsened due to my wildly beating heart. I tried to calm myself, but in the worst-case scenario, every bit of adrenaline would help. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted 2 weak light beams coming from the forest. I heard Paul shout my name. I'd never been so relieved. I finally ran out of my hiding spot to greet my friends. For quite some time, we just stood there, laughing from relief. We even got a bit cocky and considered staying. After all, there was just one, supposedly, creep lurking between the trees, and there were 3 of us. Funny. Minutes earlier, I was terrified, and suddenly I was full of tough bravado, thinking, what could possibly happen? In the end, good judgment prevailed, and we decided to leave. We packed our things, extinguished the fire, and left. We took our wine bottles to enjoy somewhere else. Somewhere well-lit and safe. This happened about 10 years ago, in August 2013. I was camping in far north Queensland, Australia, in a place called Barren Falls. I'm a 21-year-old girl, and I was camping with my 2 male friends who were backpacking from Estonia, Theo and Charlie. Where we set up camp was not an official campsite. Instead, we walked along the tourist path, climbed over a railing, followed a train track for a few kilometers, and eventually veered off into the dense forest, downhill to the river. It certainly wasn't easy to get to this area, and there wasn't any mobile phone service, but Theo knew about it from friends who had shown it to him previously. The sight was beautiful. We were surrounded by a tropical forest and were only a short walk upstream from the waterfall. After setting up camp, we walked to the waterfall where both Theo and Charlie plunged from the cliff into the water below. I decided not to follow. I was, and still am, scared of heights and the possibility of hurting myself. I sat and watched them for a while before eventually deciding to return to camp and read my book. I was totally relaxed, enjoying the serenity, taking in the beauty around me. What had been an exciting, adventurous day was then interrupted by a deep, sinister laughter coming from the forest surrounding our campsite. Instantly alerted, I felt chills run through my body as I scanned the forest trying to detect where the laughter had come from. There was nothing. I tried to forget about it, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. Theo and Charlie returned and told me that they had forgotten fire lighters for the campfire. They said that they need to travel to the nearest store to buy some and that I should wait at camp. I told them that I didn't feel comfortable staying at camp, but didn't mention the laughter I'd heard before. I didn't want them to think I was stupid, and for context, at the time I had quite a large crush on Charlie. Stupidly, I wanted him to think I was cool. They told me it would be fine, that they would be back before dark. Reluctantly, I agreed and they made their way to the store. It was about 4 p.m. and I continued reading my book. I began to think about it, and I realized that the walk back to the car was about 20 to 30 minutes, so they would be gone for well over an hour. At this time of year, dusk would be at 5:30 p.m. or so, and I would therefore likely be alone in this remote area in the dark. I distracted myself with my book, but as dusk began to settle, I struggled to read the pages, and fear began to set in. After about an hour, I started to hear footsteps in the forest. My first thought was that Theo and Charlie had returned, and I was instantly relieved that I was no longer alone. I listened for their voices, but heard nothing. My heart dropped. It dawned on me that it may be someone else, and I started panicking. Then came the laughter. The same deep, sinister laughter I'd heard before, only this time it seemed much closer. I sprung to my feet and surveyed the forest. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the other side of a stream, which was connected to the river. Standing on a log, what I saw was absolutely bizarre. He was wearing an immaculate tuxedo, with a top hat and all. I remember being puzzled as to how he was able to get to this area in such clean formal clothes, and I at first thought he may be an apparition or that I was hallucinating. I did a double take, and I was not. I then studied the man's face. It is hard to describe, but it looked like his face was burnt, like Dwight from The Walking Dead, and he had deep scarring covering his face. His hair was shoulder length, very wiry, and unkempt. He laughed, that same laugh I'd heard from the forest. Miraculously, I heard my friends' voices approaching. The man seemed alarmed and said that he saw somebody else camping upstream and that he is going to check on them. He left, and minutes later, Theo and Charlie returned. I immediately told them what happened, and they laughed and thought I was making it up, that it was a lame attempt to scare them. Tears began to gather in my eyes, and Charlie realized that I was serious. Theo didn't seem fazed. He was a very stereotypical backpacker and had the carefree nature travelers tend to have. Charlie, however, assured me that I would be okay and had me sleep between him and Theo for the next 2 nights. I barely slept at all for those nights. I kept listening for the laughter, but fortunately never heard it again. For years after, I searched online for any reports of similar encounters. I never found anything, but I have always contemplated what would have happened if Theo and Charlie hadn't returned at that moment. I shudder at the thought. I'm a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor. A couple of days ago, a good friend of mine, who is also one of my students, informed me that his dad just acquired 150 acres of land in a secluded and mountainous part of my state. This is someone with whom I've explored the woods before. He's more than competent when it comes to wilderness survival. The property, largely unexplored except for 100 yards that his dad had used for his horses, who are currently roaming freely, seemed intriguing. According to my friend, his dad got an incredible deal on the land. Given my friend, now a father of 3, doesn't get out into the woods often, I agreed to join him for what seemed like a fun outing and much-needed break. We share interests in our indigenous roots, cars, wilderness survival, and various other activities, ensuring lively conversations while in the woods. However, his dad cautioned us against exploring the woods without a gun, citing the presence of coyotes. But being natives of this area, we know coyotes rarely pose a threat to people. Additionally, my friend, whom we'll call DJ, previously mentioned seeing human-sized movement in the tree lines during his earlier visits to the property. Yet, due to his poor eyesight, he couldn't confirm what he had seen. For our exploration, I brought along my AR and a small flint napping kit, mainly for amusement. And off we went onto the property. Initially, we hiked across fields and creeks, multiple natural springs, and ponds, everything appearing normal and showcasing a beautiful landscape. But as we ventured into the unexplored forested section, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The forest exuded an eerie ambience reminiscent of the woods in the movie The Ritual. Gray and ominously quiet, except for the occasional creaking of the tall cedar trees. It felt like we were being observed from every angle. The air carried a putrid stench, akin to rotting flesh. Intrigued, we followed the smell and stumbled upon the remains of 3 to 4 cows. I took a video of them to show them to anyone who might know what could have done this. Examining the exposed skulls revealed no evidence of bullet wounds. Something had killed them, scattering their bones over a 30-yard area. Large and vague footprints surrounded the remains. Pressing deeper into the woods, accompanied only by silence, the smell of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats, we noticed various tracks along the stream. There were large coyote prints and something else, also large, intentionally avoiding the sand. Continuing, we encountered trees bent over and pinned behind others while still alive. An occurrence impossible in nature. Further along, we discovered what resembled a primitive tool made of bone, possibly a scooping tool or knife. It disturbed us because although rudimentary, it appeared more primitive than anything a human would make, yet clearly shaped intentionally. Our hike led us to a clearing with a pond encircled by large circular tracks. On the opposite side of the pond stood a peculiar little tree structure, an A-frame with rocks propped against it. However, it lacked stability, and the arrangement of rocks seemed oddly deliberate. Notably, there were no signs of campfires or camping debris nearby. This wasn't a location easily accessible from a house. I extensively photographed and filmed this strange hut-like structure. As dusk approached, we decided it was time to head back. I had a flashlight attached to my AR, but relying on that in the dark, when there's something out there capable of killing cows and making tools out of their bones, didn't seem wise. We retraced our steps out of the forest, reaching our trucks just before it became too dark. While leaving, we noticed an unidentified figure atop one of the hills, but chose not to investigate further. It's worth mentioning that the previous owner commenced construction on the property, abruptly stopped, and vacated the premises. We're planning on going back there again this weekend, but this time with a few more people and all of our camping gear. I work for a well-known university as a field biologist and have recently been contracted out to the National Forest Service. My first assignment has been in the Potomac district of the Monongahela National Forest. Basically, I receive GPS coordinates and I either drive or hike to the designated spot and do what they want. This could be setting up trail cameras or counters, monitoring equipment, trail surveys and the like, and then recording the data 24 hours after placement. No big deal. I thought it odd that they specifically requested I place the cameras only 3 feet off the ground and some of the infrared cameras in the trees at specified heights. Some of these locations are on designated trails, but some are way off the trail in places that humans would never go. Sometimes, there isn't a hotel or lodging close enough. These are the remote mountains in West Virginia, and the Forest Service has outfitted me in some pretty dank camping gear on the occasions I might have to camp. I am an experienced hiker and camper and have spent many nights alone out in the field due to my career choice. I am a woman, about 5 feet 6 inches and 130 pounds, but not really afraid of anything. Again, the Forest Service has outfitted me well, and I wear an emergency beacon that will send every law enforcement officer in the area to my location in no time. So I have been assigned to this district for a few months now and have really enjoyed my work. West Virginia is very remote and unspoiled, and that's why I enjoy my work. I get to see things most people would never see in their lives, and I have had so many positive and almost spiritual moments up until a few nights ago. I was working up near Spruce Knob, which is the highest point in West Virginia. It's essentially a complex system of trails, wilderness areas, camping, that kind of thing. It has also been snowing with howling winds and ice storms. I was camping up there to complete my work, and while the conditions were rough, I was almost enjoying it. My first night in the woods was pretty peaceful. I made dinner, set up camp, and drank some whiskey and smoked some really good bud. I snuggled down in my sleeping bag and slept like a rock. It was very cold, but I wore this turtle fur face mask thing and didn't feel the cold too much. I woke up at dawn and went about building my fire back up, and I was starting some coffee when I noticed all this churned up snow around my campsite. Not tracks, just churned up snow like someone or something had kicked it all around. Weird, but whatever. I had a 15-mile hike to set some cameras and didn't have time to really wonder about it. I set off on my hike, did what I had to do, and started back to camp. I never wear headphones or anything like that, because hearing is one of the most important senses in the wilderness. I want to be able to hear any animals, people, etc. before I see them. It was already past dark when I made it back to camp, and I was too tired to do anything except strip down to my base layer, get in my sleeping bag, and pass out. Around 2 a.m., I woke up because I could hear people talking. People. I was about 30 miles up a gravel road that was locked with Forest Service gates and about 10 miles from where my truck was parked, and I could hear voices. I completely lost it. I have a firearm, and I quietly retrieved it from my pack and got back in my sleeping bag and cocked it and waited. I was on high alert, all my senses going wild. Eventually the voices faded and I couldn't hear them anymore, but I never went back to sleep. At daylight, I emerged from my tent to more churned up snow and my 2 trail cameras hanging from a tree about 5 feet from my tent. These were cameras that I had placed 15 miles out from my campsite. I packed my stuff as fast as I could and practically ran back to my truck. Along the way, I saw a lot of footprints all around my site, and when I reached my truck, I discovered it had been broken into and my computer and other equipment had been stolen. I am currently in a luxury log cabin at some resort, too scared to retrieve my other equipment and too embarrassed to tell my superiors how scared I am. The Forest Service brought me a new truck while my other one is getting the window replaced, and I did make a report about the theft, but there is absolutely no way that I am ever going back to that site. I don't know if this means I will be fired or sent to work a desk, but out of all the years I have been doing this in national forests around the country, this is the most terrified I have ever been. I am not scared of the animals, and I have many stories to share about my encounters with them. I am scared of the people. My wife, my dog, and myself were on our second day of an 80 kilometers hike in northern Ontario, Killarney Provincial Park. We set up camp on a point about 750 meters into a lake. One way onto the point and one way off the point. We were hearing wolves since about 9 p.m. We went to bed by about 10 and the howls were getting closer and closer. Then, one owl from right behind us on the trail down to the point. I got out of the tent and started making lots of noise trying to scare it off. This usually works for bears whom we have had lots of encounters with. I didn't see anything there and didn't hear anything either. I went back to bed and lay down, trying to act confident as to not upset my wife. Then when we both heard something outside of the tent, my dog was crazy quiet but shaking. I opened the tent to find a wolf staring at me from about 15 feet away. I grabbed the bear spray and took aim. I didn't use it, but I again started screaming at the wolf and took a few charges towards it. Again, this usually works when faced with a black bear if you have no escape. The wolf didn't really care that I was there yelling at it. It kind of hung out for a few seconds, then kind of very casually walked into the tree line just far enough that I couldn't see it anymore. I built a fire between the tent and the bush, sat up all night, and kept my headlamp on all night. Had to listen to 3 or 4 wolves howl to each other the whole time, about every 20 minutes. They were very close. One, I would estimate to be within 50 yards. I was sure they were going to come and grab my dog. At about 6 a.m., a bunch of them started howling all together, way more than during the night, but it sounded like 8 to 10 wolves. We waited until about 8 a.m., then packed up and got the hell out of there. We were 36 kilometers deep. Took us 2 days to hike in, but we hiked out in 6.5 hours. About 1.5 hours into our hike out, the wolves started howling behind us again. They were following us out. On the way back, we saw a bear with 2 cubs. This would usually concern us a bit, but we were just like, get the hell out of my way. My wife lost all her toenails from the hike. And my poor dog got some serious anxiety about being in the tent. In the 90s, before everyone had cell phones, my Girl Scout troop was camping in a state park when a terrible storm came through the area with major flood warnings. The rangers at the park frantically came through every campsite and evacuated everyone to higher ground. Everyone, that is, except my group and the Boy Scouts in the site next to us. We went to bed with light rain, but woke in the middle of the night to our tents collapsing from the water quickly rising. The Boy Scouts, they were 12 to 16 years old, we were between 7 and 9, helped us quickly pack our site into our cars. Unfortunately, the roads were too dangerous to drive because we couldn't see how deep the water was. And we didn't know if any sections of the road had washed out. We abandoned all the vehicles and used the map that the scout leaders had to find some place that wouldn't be flooded. A few miles away there were treehouse cabins that were built around a tree and lofted 15 feet in the air. It was decided that we needed to move quickly, and that was our best shot. The older boys and the adults carried the smallest girls when it became clear that the wind was preventing them from staying on their feet. The wind and rain soaked everyone through to the skin. We made it to the cabins, and the adults broke in and raided the emergency supplies there for space blankets. There was no way to build a fire because there was no firewood. It had been especially dry this year, and starting campfires was forbidden due to risk of starting a forest fire. I remember shivering for hours, all of us girls in the middle of a huddle on the floor with the boys on the outside trying their best to keep us warm. One of the boys asked us if we knew any Girl Scout songs. We sang every song we knew, and the leaders taught us a few more that they had learned. At some point we convinced the boys to sing in rounds with us. The storm lasted through the night. Some girls started crying, and I remember one had a panic attack. The sound of the storm battering away at the cabin would send creaks all along throughout the space. The fact that we were essentially in a treehouse made the whole thing even more scary. I was convinced that we were going to be blown over and either fly away or all be crushed when we hit the ground. It was impossible to even see what was happening outside. You could just hear the sound of the water, the rustling of the trees, and the creaking of the cabin. If we didn't die from the cold, we'd definitely die in the rushing water. The storm continued battering the cabin long throughout the night. Eventually, once we were a bit more dry, a bunch of us managed to fall asleep. I'd been lying there for what felt like hours, struggling to doze off due to the loud banging. I'd constantly jump up when I was half asleep and couldn't quite get there. In the early hours of the morning, I was lying down staring at the ceiling when I started to finally not be able to keep my eyes open anymore. I closed them and felt myself slipping away. A branch flew through one of the windows in the cabin, throwing glass everywhere and waking up everyone. The room was full of screams, and the camp leaders were frantically trying to calm us down whilst figuring out what had happened. The place was still really dark, and a few kids had been cut with the glass. The older boys and the camp leaders helped patch everyone up and dealt with the glass situation. If there was any night to earn some medals, it was definitely this one. We all really came together, and I felt safe with those people, even though the situation was so dangerous. Morning came, the rain slowed down to a light drizzle, and a ranger showed up assessing damage to the park. He discovered us and immediately drove to get help. They returned with a bunch of trucks and all-terrain vehicles and drove us to a location where doctors were on site to evaluate us. It was sheer luck that none of us had anything worse than the chills and a few cuts from the glass. It could have gone worse than it did, and we were unbelievably lucky to have survived at all. We could have easily died in our sleep if the flood had come through all at once instead of slowly rising. If the Boy Scouts hadn't been there, then us small girls could not have made the hike to safety. If we had tried to drive, we would have been washed away. About a year ago, I embarked on a long road trip to New Mexico with a friend. We mostly camped along the way, and our first night of camping happened in the Jefferson National Forest at a campsite in West Virginia. We found some pamphlets for campsites at a gas station and decided to head to a place called White Rocks Campground. It was quite a journey, a 25-plus mile drive up a dirt road into the mountains. We were truly in the middle of nowhere. As we made our way in, we didn't spot any other cars except for one truck that followed us for about 15 minutes before turning down a different road. Along the route, we passed a massive coal factory with a sign that read, 62 days since an on-site incident. The only people we encountered on our drive were a group standing on the side of the dirt road, huddled around a plastic bin that was on fire. It was all quite unusual, but our excitement about camping and the road trip had us laughing off the weirdness rather than worrying, despite having no cell phone reception and being deep in the mountains. Upon arriving at the campground, we found it completely deserted. Not a single car or person in sight, and this campground had about 30 sites. We drove around, hoping to spot someone, but when it became clear we were alone, we randomly picked a site and decided to stay. We got out of the car and stood there, listening. The silence was unnerving. I've always loved being in the woods and have never felt scared or intimidated, but this time was different. There were no bird sounds, just thick, eerie silence. It was like something out of a Blair Witch movie. The daylight was fading fast, and we decided to start a fire and set up our tent to get comfortable. My friend was in charge of setting up the tent while I worked on the fire. As we went about our tasks, we'd occasionally stop and listen. My friend even commented that if anyone were to approach us, at least the crunchy leaves everywhere would make them easy to hear. You can probably see where this is going. I thought we were just getting spooked by our imaginations, but it genuinely felt like someone was watching us. It was the first time in my life I ever experienced that feeling. I had goosebumps, and I wanted to leave, but I kept my composure for my friend, who, as it turned out, was also internally freaking out but trying to keep it together. Once we got the fire going, the tent was set up, and our sleeping bags were ready. The sun had completely set. Sitting around the fire together, the darkness seemed to encroach upon us, making us feel suffocated. My friend tried to alleviate the tension by pulling out a book to read aloud and make us feel more at ease. While she was reading, I used my headlamp to occasionally scan the area around us. Since we arrived at the campsite, I had this nagging feeling that someone was out there in the woods. It was pitch black, and our fire acted like a beacon. My friend and I decided, screw it, let's go to bed. We thought we'd go to sleep quickly and pack up in the morning to get the heck out of there. We extinguished the fire, and I decided to grab the one knife we had, which was still in the car, keeping it beside me in the tent. After settling into our sleeping bags, my friend pulled out her cell phone to see if she had any cell reception. But, as expected, there was no signal. She tried dialing her boyfriend just in case, and I remember saying out loud, "We have no reception out here, it won't work." We lay in silence, watching our phone trying to dial out, but it eventually disconnected. Just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, suddenly, about 20 feet off to the left of our tent, we heard footsteps. These weren't quiet, gradual steps. They sounded like someone had been standing behind the tree near our tent and started walking toward us. Those crunchy leaves certainly did their job. We froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. The footsteps continued, coming closer to the tent, then veering behind it for a couple of yards before stopping. The silence that followed was chilling. These were heavy, booted footsteps, with the distinct rhythm of a person walking, not an animal. My friend grabbed the knife that was next to my bag, and with her headlamp on, unzipped the tent and stepped out. She stood in front of the tent with her knife drawn, scanning the area with her light. She was nothing short of a warrior. We both listened for more footsteps or voices during what felt like an eternity of silence. I could see the light from my friend's headlamp darting around the trees, but there was nothing there. She leaned back into the tent and whispered, "We're getting the hell out of here." We packed up everything within maybe 10 minutes, moving quickly, and then we bolted from the campsite. Looking back on it, it's amazing how we didn't lose our heads. We stayed calm while packing, even though we were internally screaming with terror. We only had our headlamps on, and the whole time we were packing up, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hill people were watching us and waiting to grab us and pull us into the darkness. We felt entirely helpless. But it didn't seem real, like we were just psyching ourselves out. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as we sped away. Then came the confirmation that someone or something had been tracking us. As we pulled out of the campsite, we spotted 2 dirty black trucks pulled off to the side of the road, concealed in the trees but still visible. They had definitely not been there when we arrived earlier. The nearest residential homes were about 15 miles away. We didn't see anyone around the trucks, but we didn't stop to look. We reached a motel and stayed there for the night. We share our story with the motel owner, who was incredibly kind and comforting. He even gave us some cash for another motel if we needed it. I made a promise to that man that I would give him a stellar review. I'll remember every detail of that night for the rest of my life. The unsettling feeling of being watched, the sudden footsteps so close to our tent, and the ominous black trucks by the road. I was about 11, my sister was 13. We slept in the living room of a little caravan we used to stay in over summer. There wasn't a lot to do, the campsite didn't have any amenities. I'd pass the time playing with my sister, taking walks or playing the Nintendo. This was '98, so Castlevania and Donkey Kong Country weren't nostalgic yet, they were just lame. I couldn't wait to get home and back to the PC so I could get my theme hospital on. But mostly I'd read. I had a collection of books about ghosts, UFOs, cryptids, and such. I'd pick them up at library sales or in charity shops. My favorites were the unexplained true stories, like the Dover Demon or the Gulf Breeze incident. There was a quarry on the other side of the site. Sometimes at night I'd pretend the two red lights were the eyes of the Mothman who'd swoop down to terrorize my family. What I'm getting at here is I was a kid, and I had an active imagination, but I never believed anything spooky would actually happen to me. If something out of the ordinary happens, it's just your mind playing tricks on you, right? I woke up one morning around 6:20. It was gray outside, the sun had just come up, but fog and cloudy skies ensured it wasn't too bright. I felt uneasy, because I'd usually sleep till 9 at least. It was silent. My sister wasn't even snoring as she normally did. And then I heard it. It sounded like a horse galloping. It was just outside the window. It was unsettling, to say the least. Had a horse escaped from a nearby field? Surely not. I'd never seen any horses around here, and what's more, it didn't sound heavy enough. Whatever it was making circles around the caravan. I'd hear it fade a little as it looped around the other end where my parents slept, and then get louder, almost next to my head. It had the irregular rhythm of a gallop, but I never heard 4 legs. It was almost like a person was skipping very, very quickly, but no person could be heavy enough to make that kind of noise on soft ground. It was fading off into the distance. Whatever it was seemed to have ran off. I breathed a little easier. What a crazy situation. Maybe I hadn't fully woken up yet and was having a dream hangover. And then it came back. It was getting louder and more insistent. I decided to take my chances. "Rosie? Are you awake?" "Yeah," she said, voice quivering. "You can hear that, right?" "Yeah." "What is it?" "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "I'm afraid to look outside though." "Why?" "I'm afraid it might be the devil." She moaned in fear. There was a thump from the other end of the caravan, like whatever was outside had grazed it. I pulled my blanket tighter around me. After about a minute, it faded again. I told myself if it came back, I'd look outside, and the devil be damned. It didn't come back. My parents woke up around 8, made us breakfast, and the fog cleared. We asked them if they'd heard anything strange earlier. They hadn't. There were no scrapes on the caravan that would suggest something heavy bumping against it. Apart from my sister, there was no evidence that anything had ever happened, except for one rough footprint outside the front door in the shape of a hoof. To this day, I regret not looking outside to see what it was. But when I wake up in the middle of the night and everything seems so strange, I understand why. I love to go camping. Been doing it my whole life. Never had a scary experience until this past summer. My boyfriend and I decided to go out to the gorge for some quality time camping. We had always gone with several other people, but this was the first time it was just the two of us. When we got out of the car to prepare our gear for the hike back to the camping spot, two sketchy-looking dudes came out of the trailhead, looked us up and down, and got into their old-school VW camper van. I had a weird feeling but shrugged it off and proceeded back to our camping spot. I had previously camped in the same area a handful of times and knew it pretty well. Once we got back there, I knew of a handful of different camping spots and proceeded to check them all out for the one that would be ideal. I noticed what looked like someone camping further up the hill, so I picked a spot a little further down where we'd be mostly out of sight. Not out of earshot though, as I heard yelling over on the trail. It was starting to get dark by the time we got everything set up, so I figured I'd start looking for firewood. Suddenly this guy appears out of nowhere and asks us if we'd like any help and offered to sell us a bundle of firewood for $10. I laughed because we were in the woods, thus surrounded by wood which I could pick up off the ground for free. He then said I wouldn't find much wood because they'd already cleared it out over the past few weeks. Few weeks? I asked him how long he'd been camping up there, and he said almost a month. The longest anyone can camp in this area, a national forest, is 2 weeks. I already had the creeps about him, and he claimed he was up there by himself. I asked him why I heard him yelling with someone then, and why he had referred to more people when talking about the wood. He stammered and was like, yeah, there's some dudes I know camping over there up on the other side of the river. Then he proceeds to tell us that he's been lonely since he arrived. He was from Pennsylvania, took a bus to Lexington, Kentucky, and had been living in the woods back behind where I currently work. I knew exactly where he was talking about because I see homeless, immigrants, and drug addicts coming in and out of those woods every day. So basically he was a homeless man who somehow got a ride out to the gorge and decided he would just live there instead. He had been living on snakes, bugs, and selling firewood for food and beer. But he said we were the first people he'd seen in a few weeks. His stories were all over the place, and I knew he was lying about a lot of what he told us. He wasn't alone even though he claimed to be. He even took us to his camp where there was tons of stuff for several guys, not just one. He said he liked camping up top where he could see everything and everyone. By now it was dark and he helped us get a fire going. I was trying to politely get him on his way back up the hill so I could have a minute to process all of this. When he left, I started whispering to my boyfriend that there was no way in hell I could sleep with that lying sketchy homeless creep right up the hill. We didn't have a gun, knife, or even a dog to protect ourselves if we needed to. I said let's quietly get our shit together and get the hell out of here. Which we did, only we left our new tarps set up because they would make too much noise and he'd know we were leaving. As soon as I stood up with my pack, ready to get the hell out of Dodge, he yells, "How's it going?" and we proceeded to GTFO as quickly and quietly as possible. In my mind, we were either getting robbed, kidnapped, killed, or something else, because he was not alone. His stories didn't add up, and his background of where he came from made me believe he was running from something and was trying to hide by living off the grid. I called the Rangers the next morning and told them about him. Luckily, all he got from us was a set of new tarps. Weeks later, we saw on the news that multiple people had gone missing in the area and that there was a manhunt for the guy who wouldn't leave us alone. I always think about how we really dodged a bullet when I insisted that we left. We found a new camping spot the next year. I remember that summer vividly. I was about 15, and my family decided to spend a few weeks camping near the lake. It was the perfect escape from the sweltering heat of the city. We set up our campsite, complete with a cozy tent and a small bonfire pit. Days were filled with swimming, hiking, and enjoying the company of my parents and younger brother. One evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the tranquil waters. The crackling of the campfire filled the air, and we all huddled close, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. My little brother was captivated by the stars that dotted the night sky, and my parents laughed and reminisced about their own childhood camping trips. As the fire dwindled and everyone retreated to their tents, I lay in my sleeping bag, feeling the cool breeze against my skin. I could hear the distant hum of insects and the soft lapping of water against the shore. It was peaceful, serene, until a rustling noise interrupted the quiet. I lay still, my heart quickening as I strained my ears to listen. The rustling grew louder, closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the sound was coming from just outside my tent. It was too rhythmic to be the wind, it sounded deliberate. Fear clenched my chest, and I held my breath, hoping that whatever was out there would just move along. But then, I heard it, a low, guttural growl. My pulse raced, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I knew I needed to see what was causing the noise, even though every fiber of my being was screaming for me to stay hidden. With shaky hands, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows that danced on the ground. And there, just a few feet away, I saw it. It was a large, hulking figure, partially obscured by the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes locked onto it, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through the night. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and the figure took a step closer. Fear paralyzed me, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. My instincts told me to stay hidden, to stay quiet, but curiosity and dread pushed me to inch the tent flap open just a bit more. That's when I saw its shape, a massive, shadowy creature with elongated limbs and sharp glistening teeth. Its eyes never left mine as it stood there, almost as if it were studying me, assessing my fear. As the seconds dragged on, I felt a sense of dread. I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a predator, a force much more powerful than me. My heart pounded in my chest, drowning out the sounds of the night, as I realized that whatever this creature was, it was not something to be trifled with. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing into the night. The woods fell silent. I zipped the tent shut, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. Morning came, and I emerged from my tent, shaken but determined to find some rational explanation for the night's terror. I scoured the area around the campsite, half hoping to find evidence of a prank or a wandering animal, but there was nothing, no signs that the creature had ever been there. I tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and the dark of the night playing tricks on my mind. Reluctantly, I shared my experience with my parents over breakfast, expecting them to dismiss it as the product of my teenage imagination. My dad chuckled, attributing the sounds to a nocturnal animal, probably just a bear rummaging around the campsite. Mom nodded in agreement, mentioning that bears were known to roam these parts from time to time. As much as I wanted to accept their explanation, a gnawing feeling remained deep within me. I knew what I'd seen and heard. It was no bear. It was something bigger, something much scarier. Even now, years later, whenever I'm surrounded by the tranquility of the gray outdoors, I can't help but think about that night. I've heard the usual explanations, the logical reasoning, but deep down, I'm certain that what I encountered was something different, something you hear about in urban legends. I always think about going back to that place with some friends and searching for that monster. But that's probably not a good idea, is it? I'm Jamie, a 32-year-old freelance photographer from Portland. I've always enjoyed the peace of late-night drives. There's something calming about being alone on the road, the city lights fading behind you, and the open space ahead. But a few nights ago, a drive I thought would be relaxing turned into a nightmare I can't shake off. It was a Friday night. Around midnight, I decided to take a drive out of town, using a rural stretch I frequently use to unwind. The road is known for its solitude and natural beauty, and I thought it would be a good way to decompress. The drive started smoothly. The city lights disappeared, and all I could see was my headlights cutting through the darkness. The road is narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees. The isolation has always felt peaceful to me, but tonight something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the night seemed heavier. About halfway through, my car began to sputter. I initially thought it was a minor issue, but soon the engine lost power completely, and the car coasted to a stop. I tried restarting it, but nothing worked. My phone had no signal, so calling for roadside assistance was out of the question. The situation was starting to feel dire. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and locked the car before starting to walk. My goal was to find the nearest town, which I knew was several miles away. The woods on either side of the road felt like they were closing in on me. With only my flashlight for company, I trudged on, trying to ignore the sense of isolation that grew with every step. After a couple of hours, I saw a distant light. It was faint but visible, and it gave me hope. I quickened my pace, my exhaustion temporarily forgotten. As I approached, I realized the light was coming from an old farmhouse. I was relieved but apprehensive. The place looked abandoned and decrepit, but I had no other options. I knocked on the door, my heart racing. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a man in his 60s, with a grizzled beard and a wary expression, peered out. His eyes were sharp and seemed to study me carefully. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I explained that my car had broken down and that I'd walked for hours to get help. The man introduced himself as Earl and seemed to take pity on me. He agreed to help and said he'd drive me back to my car with his tow truck. As we drove back to where my car was parked, I tried to make small talk to ease the tension. Earl was polite but distant, and his eyes kept darting to the road behind us. I started to feel uneasy. Why was he so jumpy? When we arrived at my car, he got to work hooking it up to the tow truck. I watched, my exhaustion making me feel vulnerable. Earl worked quickly, but his movements seemed a little too practiced, almost mechanical. My sense of unease grew stronger. As he was finishing up, he suddenly stopped and turned to me. "You know," he said, "it's not safe out here at night. Lots of folks have had problems. You're lucky I came by." I forced a nervous laugh. I appreciate it. I'm just glad I found you. Earl's eyes narrowed. You're very lucky. There are things out here you don't want to encounter. I was about to ask him what he meant when I heard an engine growling in the distance. Earl's demeanor shifted. He seemed suddenly alert, almost anxious. We need to get out of here, he said sharply. Now. Before I could react, Earl shoved me towards the tow truck and jumped into the driver's seat. I barely had time to process what was happening before the truck lurched forward, dragging my car behind it. What's going on? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road and his grip on the steering wheel. We've got to get to town. There's no time for explanations. The drive was tense and silent. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror and I could see the truck in the distance, pulling up exactly where we just were. I felt a growing sense of dread. Who were those people, and why was Earl so intent on avoiding them? As we approached the edge of town, Earl finally spoke. They're the reason I stay away from people, why I keep to myself. They're dangerous. I was bewildered. What are you talking about? Who are those people? Earl shook his head. It's better if you don't know. Just stay away from this area. It's not safe for people like you. He dropped me off at a gas station on the outskirts of town, and I thanked him, though my gratitude was overshadowed by confusion and fear. Earl didn't wait for my response. He drove off quickly, leaving me with a sense of foreboding that wouldn't leave me. I finally got my car towed to a nearby mechanic and made my way home. I was exhausted and shaken, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I've tried to make sense of what happened, but the fear I felt is still fresh. I don't know what Earl was hiding or who those people were, but I'm certain that night was more than just a series of unfortunate events. I've learned to be more cautious on my night drives and avoid that place altogether. That stretch of road is no longer my peaceful place. So, thanks for the help that night, though I wish you had been more forthcoming. And to anyone driving out there, be careful. Some things are better left unexplored, and some roads should be avoided, especially when the darkness hides more than you can imagine. I'm Alex, a 28-year-old graphic designer living in Denver. I've always been drawn to the quiet, solitary nature of late-night drives. There's something about the stillness of the world at night that helps me clear my mind and escape from the daily grind. But a few weeks ago, a routine drive turned into a nightmarish ordeal that still haunts me. It was a Saturday night in early June, and I had been working long hours on a major project at the office. I was exhausted and needed a break from staring at my computer screen. So, around midnight, I decided to take a drive on Route 54, a highway that bends through the countryside just outside of Denver. It's a route I've driven many times before, and while it's remote, it's always felt safe and familiar. As I headed out, the city lights of Denver gradually disappeared behind me, and the road stretched out in front of me, illuminated only by my headlights. I had the radio on low, playing some mellow tunes, and I felt the usual sense of calm that came with driving through the quiet night. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something odd. A car was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. The car was a beat-up sedan, and it looked like it had been there for a while. I couldn't see anyone around, but it was strange to see a car in that condition in such a desolate area. Should I stop and see if they need help? I thought to myself. I've always been the kind of person who wants to help others, but the isolation of this stretch of road made me hesitant. I continued driving, convincing myself that it was probably nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I drove on, I started thinking about how late it was and how far from civilization I was. The darkness seemed thicker, and the quiet seemed more oppressive. The only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the sedan following me, but it was just empty road behind me. A few miles later, I saw headlights approaching from behind. I was relieved to see another car, and I hoped that maybe they would have some insight into the situation with the broken-down sedan. As the car drew closer, I noticed it was an old pickup truck. It passed by quickly, but something about it made me uneasy. The driver didn't even glance my way, which was strange considering we were the only vehicles on the road. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease and focused on the drive. But as I rounded a bend, I was hit with a sense of dread. The road ahead was blocked by a large, makeshift barrier made of wooden planks and old tires. I had no way to get around it, and the barrier seemed intentionally placed to block the road. What the hell? I muttered, my pulse quickening. I stopped the car and put it in park, trying to think of what to do next. My phone had no signal out here, so calling for help was out of the question. I was completely on my own. I turned off the engine and got out of the car to inspect the barrier. It was crudely built, and it didn't look like it had been there for very long. My heart was pounding as I tried to figure out how to move it. I was about to start pushing the planks aside when I heard a noise coming from the woods. It was a low, shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging through the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the trees, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. I didn't want to panic, but the sound was growing louder and closer. Suddenly, the pickup truck I had seen earlier came into view again. It was moving slowly and seemed to be circling back. My first instinct was to get back in my car and lock the doors, but I knew I had to do something about the barrier if I wanted to get out of there. I was frozen, caught between the fear of the unknown and the practical need to clear the road. The truck stopped behind my car, and I saw the driver get out. It was a man in his mid-40s, with a grizzled beard and a weathered face. He looked at me with a curious expression and then at the barrier. I felt a mixture of relief and suspicion. "Need some help?" he called out. His voice was gruff but not unfriendly. I hesitated before replying. "Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to move it." The man walked over and started helping me with the barrier. We worked in silence. I was clearly on edge. I glanced at the truck and saw a toolbox in the back. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about this whole situation. As we moved the last of the planks, the man started talking. "This area's been having some trouble lately," he said. "Strange things happening." "What kind of strange things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged. "Just rumors. People say there's gangs out here causing trouble, taking things that ain't theirs, breaking into places they don't belong. It's enough to keep people on edge." I felt a chill run down my spine. I saw a car back there with its hazard lights on. "Did you know anything about that?" The man's face tightened, and he looked away. "Nope. Haven't seen it." We finished clearing the road, and he offered to follow me until I was back on a main route. I was grateful but still uneasy. As we drove, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the sedan or the man's truck following me. Eventually, we reached a more populated area with streetlights and a gas station. I thanked the man and went on my way. I didn't look back, not wanting to see if he was still following me. When I finally got home, I was exhausted and shaken. The whole experience felt surreal, like something out of a horror movie. I couldn't stop thinking about the broken down sedan, the mysterious barrier, and the man in the pickup truck. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what happened. I asked around, but no one seemed to know anything about strange occurrences on Route 54. I considered reporting it to the authorities, but what exactly would I tell them? Looking back, I'm still not sure what I encountered that night. The only conclusion I could come to was that there had been some trouble in the area and the man in the truck set up the barrier to control who was going up and down the road. The memory of that drive still sends shivers down my spine. I've learned to be more cautious and to trust my instincts. Late night drives used to be my favorite way to unwind, but now they're a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. This happened back in my university days when I was on the way back from a trip with my friend. I guess I must have misread the map, or we took some kind of shortcut because we got lost somewhere on the mountain roads. My friend was driving, and I was supposed to be the navigator. It was the one job I had. It was around 8 p.m., but it was already really dark since we were in the shadow of the mountains. I noticed a white truck up ahead and said to my friend, if we follow the truck, we would probably get back to a main road in no time. I thought it was a pretty solid plan, considering I had no clue where we were, let alone what mountain we were on. We tailed the truck for a while, then realized we were going further and further from the main road and deeper into the desolate mountain roads. As the roads turned to dirt and became one-lane paths, the truck, better suited to these roads, sped up, and we lost sight of it. It was weird and kind of unlikely for the truck to disappear all of a sudden. There was nothing ahead of us apart from dark, dirty mountain roads. It was playing on my mind, but our priority was getting back to a main road. I was flipping through a map with a torch held in my mouth. There was no cell phone coverage. We were going further down the road when I noticed some lights behind our car. I looked in the wing mirror and noticed a white truck behind us. It was the same truck we had been tailing. I told my pal what I'd just seen, and we both watched the truck in the mirrors. We began to get a little creeped out by this. The truck then turned its lights off. Is it even possible to navigate these winding mountain roads with the lights off? It was getting really freaky now. I was nervous, and I could tell that my friend was even more nervous than me. I stated the obvious at this point. I think that truck from before is behind us. He's following us. As soon as I said that, I began to swear. My friend shifted nervously in his seat. He sped up to test my theory, and the truck behind sped up to catch us, still with its lights out. We didn't know what to do. We began to argue about it. It was incredibly tense. Then, suddenly, the truck behind us seemed to disappear. It felt totally hopeless. Whoever was in the truck clearly knew the roads. I really wish we hadn't decided to follow that guy. We kept going forward on the one-lane road, keeping an eye out for a chance to turn back, sending snappy, bitey remarks to each other about how we could get out of this mess. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the truck swerved into our lane again and slammed on its brakes. My friend reacted in time, and once again, we were behind the white truck. He said, if we don't do something, it's gonna end bad. This was the worst. I've never felt so stressed out. A moment or two later, we reached a point where the road got wider, and my friend took his chance. We spun into a U-turn. There wasn't too much space to turn, so my friend's car kissed the guardrail on our escape. We noticed points in the road where the truck could have disappeared and appeared in front of us that answered the question of how it was possible, but we still had the unanswered question of why. Why was this guy doing this to us? We knew that we were on our way back to civilization, so my friend floored it while I kept nervously glancing over my shoulder to see if the truck was following us. I kept asking him to speed up, but I knew that he couldn't, and that truck could pop out of nowhere again at any moment. So, we kept heading down those dirt roads until eventually they became concrete again. I saw the lights of people's homes. And before long, we came across a non-franchised gas station. My friend immediately pulled in, and we skidded to a halt. My friend ran in and grabbed the clerk by his arm and frantically explained the situation. He asked the guy to call the cops and for directions to get off these mountain roads. The clerk didn't seem that interested in our plea for help, so we got him to go outside. My friend then said, "Believe us, there's someone chasing us." "Okay then, if a white truck with all its lights off turns up at any second, then will you believe us?" And just as he finished saying that, the truck arrived with its lights still off. It screeched to a stop a few meters away from the gas station, then it slowly turned around and headed back into the darkness. We weren't able to get a look at the driver, but we noticed something. There was some sort of logo and some text on the side of the truck. The clerk at the gas station said, "Oh, now I understand you. The guys from the church. Maybe cult's a better word." I pressed him for more information, and it turns out that apparently the entire mountain is their territory. They own a village, and the leaders and the followers all live there together. I understand that there are cults, but I didn't understand why that truck was following us. I asked why they'd follow us, and according to the old fellow at the gas station, there are frequent attempts to escape by followers of the cult who change their mind. So the cult is very wary of cars getting anywhere near their village. Their reckless driving and relentless pursuits of anyone who gets close to the village is said to be the cause of numerous accidents up here in the mountains. I remember that the cult featured quite heavily on the news and in the media a few years after, but it seems to have gone radio silent since. I guess that guy who followed us was a lookout for escapees or for families trying to rescue their loved ones or something. It was a very creepy experience. I took in a hitchhiker who turned out to be legitimately crazy. I won't ever do that again, and hopefully, my experience will discourage you. I live in a foreign country, and I don't know about your country's sanitary measures against the epidemic, but at the time, we were no longer confined. It happened in September, 2 years ago. I was driving from my parents' house to a friend's apartment near our college campus. It was an hour-and-a-half drive. We had plans to spend the weekend together after not seeing each other for months. Even though the incident is not related to my friend in any way, it just hit me how dangerous it actually was when I started telling them what happened. I remember one of them saying, "This must have been the worst 45-minute drive of my life." I laughed at it back then, but it hits me now how true it was. I left quite late that day, around 9 p.m. I remember the sun had already set, and I was going to arrive late, which I didn't like, but I was used to the road as I'd often taken it. For a bit of context, it was an hour and a half drive, and I would usually stop midway in a McDonald's parking lot to smoke a cigarette before carrying on. Just remember this for later. I saw the hitchhiker not long after I left my parents' house. I had driven for about 10 to 15 minutes or so when I saw him at the exit of a roundabout. He was a tall, slender guy with one of those tiny shoulder bags worn across the chest. I thought he was a guy in his 20s who had just been dropped off by his friends on his way back from a party or something. Which was stupid because it was still too early for a party to end. But that's not the first thought I had. I immediately felt sympathy and stopped. I opened the passenger side window and asked where he was going. I realized right away that he was way older than I thought, at least in his 30s. He had a really pale face, and the way he looked at me honestly freaked me out. The guy was going in my direction, to the town where I would stop midway to take a break. I don't know what I was thinking, to be honest. I just responded automatically. It was on my way, and he got in the car. Then I had the worst 45 minutes of my life. I don't mean to be dramatic, but it really was hell. I knew right away I'd made a mistake as I drove off because as soon as I started driving, he held his stomach tight, crouched in the passenger seat, going back and forth, saying he wasn't feeling good. I offered to open the window for some fresh air, but he said he just had to take his meds. Saying I felt uncomfortable is an understatement. I remember thinking I'd screwed up and that whatever was going to happen, I should not stop under any circumstances. The first thing I did was to ask him if he would be okay if I dropped him off at the city's McDonald's. I think he agreed, but either way, it didn't matter because I wasn't planning on stopping elsewhere. I was already freaked out. I thought I'd pretend to focus on the road and try to appear as calm as I could, and he kept talking during this whole time. I don't remember in what order it happened exactly, but I remember he asked me if he could look at my nails, to which I responded I was driving. He apologized and said I shouldn't worry because he'd never assaulted anyone. He told me his girlfriend was mad at him, wanted to break up with him if he didn't come back. He asked where I was going, what I was planning to do tonight, and if I was planning to have a long, steaming shower. He kept going, asking if I had a boyfriend and how we liked to do it. I said that was private and that I did not want to answer. He nodded and said that he used to be young like me until he got arrested. He insisted twice that we were followed by cars. He asked me if I smoked and I said no. He offered me a cigarette. I said it's nice, but he didn't have to. He left a cigarette on the board, took out his phone at one point, and wanted to show me a picture of him and a picture of his mom, saying she was beautiful. I took a quick glimpse, and the thing was broken. It had multiple straight black lines of broken pixels. It was reddish on the left and yellowish on the right, which made the picture really creepy. He got mad at that point because I was just taking a quick glimpse and he started talking louder, saying I didn't give a crap about what he was saying. I straight up said, I'm listening, I can't watch, I'm driving. He calmed down immediately, said okay, and apologized, and wanted to show me another picture. He asked if this was my car. I said it was my parents'. Somehow, I did not want him to think I was rich or had any kind of money. I'm just a young student who has no money. Leave me alone. I lied, saying I had hit a deer last week and I was trying to focus and pay attention because I didn't want to break my parents' car. I hoped he would shut up. At some point, he was just straight up staring at me and muttered, "Poor thing," then straightened up and pointed to a road sign in a panic, saying, "I meant the road sign, poor road sign." Honestly, I think at that point I was thinking if he ever tried anything, I would crash this car with both of us in it, into a tree. because if I could not make it out, neither would he. I'm ashamed to say this, but I didn't want him to get out of this easily. He screamed that his name was Archangel Michael. He asked my name, and I gave a fake name. He kept asking if I remembered his name, and suddenly crouched himself in a panic, going back and forth again, saying I should know his name. I just said okay. To be honest, that was the only thing I would say. In the end, when we got to the city where he had to stop, he asked if I could take him to the train station. It was almost 10 p.m., and I knew there were no trains, no lights, and surely no other cars or human presence. I told him we said we'd stop at the McDonald's, and he nodded and said, yes, yes. He said I was nice and put a coin on the board next to the cigarette. I stopped in the parking lot, didn't park, just stopped right there in the middle of the way where I felt the most exposed. He just left, saying, see you later, and I drove away very fast. I never saw or heard from him again.